hear me? Let's see. Thanks so much for those really wonderful papers. They're really rich, and I'm going to kind of reduce them because I found a theme. But then I'm sure that the questions will sort of blow it back up again. So please humor me for just a couple of moments, all right? So I was inspired by Camilia's book title, Misreading the Bengal Delta, and I was struck that all three of the papers in the panel today identify misreadings of various landscapes. So Sarah Besky argues that Kalimpong, West Bengal, is not a stable and unchanging place. It's not a bucolic escape from the capitalist processes warming and polluting Indian cities. Camellia argues that Bangladesh is not simply sinking beneath seas that are rising because of climate change. And Kadri argues that Ekta Nagar in Gujarat is not a benign spiritual utopia, a form of resistance, or a pristine Eden. Each paper traces where such misreadings might come from, how they circulate, what they misrecognize, and to what effects. Each offers a corrective. So I first want to rehearse this, my reading of the misreadings that they're also reading, and explain how together I think that all of these readings and their correctives tell us something about how nature cultures or landscapes or even waterscapes work semiotically and ideologically in a way that's useful for many of the discussions that we've been having here at this conference. So I'll just start with the last paper. Sarah points to, quote, colonial ways of seeing the Himalayan countryside that have long recirculated in tea marketing and have been newly repurposed by politicians like Mamata Banerjee for an audience of middle class and I guess actually a wide range of urbanites. A bucolic image of Kalimpong obscures what Besky calls the, quote, long, weedy trajectory of resource extraction in the Himalayas. The colonial biopolitical regime that imposed British-style landed estates in the 19th century, colonial hierarchies of labor that racialized Nepalis as loyal servants, and now capital accumulation through extracting women's affective labor for the tourism industry in the face of ecological and market forces that have rendered agriculture untenable. Such tourism has further degraded local environments. So what's misread here is work and the regimes of capitalist extraction that structure it, and Besky's corrective is unearthing and highlighting that long, weedy trajectory of capitalism. Camellia demonstrates that the story of Bangladeshis as climate victims has been created by and circulates among developmental professionals. And it helps them to secure project funding from donors energized by the climate emergency, as well as elites and capitalists who see profit in climate adaptation. As she demonstrates, a simplistic story about Bangladesh as climate victim misrecognizes the complex causalities of flooding in the Bengal Delta. It ignores local environmental knowledge and histories of colonial embankments. And the story isn't just wrong, it fuels developmental interventions that exacerbate flooding, inequality, and gender disparities. Aggravating the environmental degradation the stories are supposed to identify and fix. So her corrective is to provide the local knowledge and history needed to understand the complex role of embankments and multiple kinds of flooding, as well as to plumb the social networks of development brokers, and this is something that she discusses more in the book, who may not believe in the reductive climate narrative, but who for reasons of profit, fear, expediency, et cetera, help to translate and perpetuate it. Her research helps us to understand the politics and social pressures that fuel the circulation and uptake of environmental stories. The misreading that Kadri corrects in her paper are those of other scholars, Asianists, environmental humanists, and others who see, quote, spiritual and religious movements as viable resources for ecological ideas and practices in creating utopian spaces beyond developmentalist modernity, end quote. The problem with such a naive understanding, she argues, is that it can reify categories like nature, culture, and religion, and risk celebrating instead of exposing complex and powerful political projects. The corrective that she offers is her own sophisticated reading of a place, Ekta Nagar, which demonstrates that far from benign spiritualism, the Statue of Unity and its touristic surrounds combine cosmology, techno-modernism, and ecology to promote an internally colonizing Hindutva. So if we stay with that paper for a moment, Kadri begins with iconopraxis, although she didn't actually use the word in the talk, but that's okay, which she defines as, quote, image production, engagement, affect, and efficacy. It's a term I really like. But she actually moves well beyond images to interpret multimodal effects of lights and text and objects and natural phenomena that are totally man-made as a sort of complex image and assemblage. So what we're talking about here is clearly not just looking or just reading, literally, as in like the kind of misreading that we're talking about, but communication more broadly and signs more broadly. Kadri explicates a network of interconnected signs producing complex effects such that all of our senses are enrolled in practices of interpretation. I mean, like if we were there, all of our senses would be enrolled. As all of the papers demonstrate, so the sign processes that they're discussing are ideological because they're in some people's interest over others. So what we have in these case studies is not just a misreading, but misrecognition in a Bourdieuian sense. Such ideological semiotic processes operate through erasure, paring down complex histories, structures, and relationships, and making some things or actors visible while peripheralizing others. And even as these stories about landscapes are structured by discourses and practices, everything from World Bank reports and tea advertisements and exhibit signage, they seem natural, so they legitimize as well as erase. In the face of the ideological work of landscapes, then, all of the papers demonstrate the importance of telling new stories, and particularly of drawing on long histories to demonstrate the entanglements of pasts and presents. In the papers, the colonial, post-colonial, and neoliberal do not appear as phases in a linear succession, but as ongoing and overlapping logics and processes that are retooled to new political ends. When I was reading, I thought of Joel Lee's article, Odor and Order, How Caste is Inscribed in Space and Sensoria from 2017, in which he untangles how the Brahminical spatial practices that inscribe village life continue to inform urban space, such that Dalit sanitation workers in UP live and work among malodor. He argues that in addition to the many adverse health effects that result from proximity to malodorous and toxic chemicals, Dalits themselves indeed, quote, all inhabitants of caste space are forged into agents in its intergenerational reproduction, end quote, by becoming signs of their place in the social order. He calls this the pedagogy of place. And I should note that Lee's pedagogy of place is not positive, obviously, as in the sort of landist pedagogy that, Mabel, you had mentioned the other day, but as a way of grappling with how social inequalities are reproduced. So I feel like all of the papers here similarly unpack how hierarchies of people are produced and reproduced through pedagogies of place. Sarah argues that colonial racial ideology still informs ideas about the suitability of people from the hills for service work. In taking up the work of homestays, Kalimpong residents are enrolled anew in reinforcing class and urban-rural distinctions. Similarly, Kadri argues that Adivasis are, quote, conscripted into staging tourist attractions, both as workers and as exhibits in themselves, end quote. In so doing, they are made into signs of Modi's developmental, colonial, and colonizing project. Camellia demonstrates that the production of climate-reductive narratives in Bangladesh relies on and reinforces hierarchies of language, expertise, class, and region within the development industry as brokers and donors from Bangladesh and abroad come together in complex shifting networks. So as an anthropologist, it's these social implications that I find very exciting and important. The papers demonstrate that the ideas that legitimate the differential treatment of people, their arrangement into hierarchies of status and life chances emerge through nature, cultural, and ecological change and attempts to remedy and narrativize such changes. So I'll just end with a couple of questions. For Kadri, you provide a really wonderfully layered and rich interpretation of the exhibits, and I wondered about other people's readings of the exhibits and whether you encountered people's kind of reactions and responses, as well as some of the Adivasi workers' kind of feelings about being there. And of course, it's probably, again, well beyond the paper, but love to know more about the production, like the design of some of these exhibits and the thoughts behind them. For Sarah, I we saw a little bit of this, but I'd love to see more of the tourism brochures and websites, et cetera, and kind of the images of domesticity and femininity and labor that are in them, as well as I kind of wondered if residents feel a pressure to kind of perform some sort of bucolic tradition in ways through dress or language or mannerisms. And I'm thinking about the sort of language, the literature on like kind of language and neoliberalism and service work that's out there in anthropology. And for Camelia, since images, you include the image that you wanted to have on the cover of the man sort of standing in the flooding. And I was thinking about the ways, like, kind of thinking with Kadri about iconopraxis and the ways in which actually this climate narrative has just, the audience for it is now so large. It's been like recirculated through so many different venues. I'm thinking that there's probably like an iconopraxis that could be written about the imagery that's coming out of Bangladesh. But I also wondered, just because your paper didn't touch on it as much, if you could talk a little bit, maybe in the Q&A, about the penalties that Bangladeshi development workers face for speaking out, like the kind of pressures on them to conform to a certain narrative. I found like really compelling in your work. So thank you, everybody. Should we take some more questions, or do you want to start? Yeah, let's take more. There's lots of questions. Okay, all right. I'll take like 3 or 4 questions. We'll bundle them, and then we'll keep going. So Mabel, do you want to start? Is there a... Okay, great.
Thank you. I really enjoyed all the presentations. And this is such a great way to close this conference. So I have questions for Sarah and Camelia and more of a comment for Kadri. So I was wondering, Camelia, like you talked about the climate change as a spice, but beyond the colonial or international actors or even the development funding kind of interests, right, that are pushing these embankments as a solution, I was wondering, do you know anything about are there like local politicians, cronies, brokers that are benefiting from these embankments? And I don't know if there's anything, like in Indian context, I've heard about sand mining mafia. I don't know if there's something that is happening at the local level beyond just these really kind of like these bigger, forces. Yeah, so I would love to hear a little bit more about that. And Kadri, I was thinking about I was really struck by the retooled Brahmanical cosmography that you were talking about. And there's so much literature on the Narmada movement, but also the shift to run of the river and the Himalayan region was actually in response to a lot of the Narmada, movement and the protests and the massive displacement. So run of the river projects don't displace as many, because they just have tunnels. They just require land at the beginning and end of the tunnel. So they were kind of posed as that they are not going to have as much displacement as large reservoir dams. So I was just very struck by this idea of the Brahmanical cosmography and how the Himalayas also kind of figure in this Vedic, like this ancient Hindu kind of. So there's this shift from, Narmada, large reservoir dams, to run of the river in the Himalayan region, but also like all the things that you're seeing with Hindu nationalism, territorial expansion in this region. So not a question, but just something. And with Sarah, I was like, in Sikkim also, it's very different land tenure, rights, very different kind of protections. Don't have the Bengali kind of elite kind of coming in and being able to claim land like that. But it's very interesting what struck me. So the anti-dam movement, so a lot of the people who were involved in the anti-dam movement, they were blacklisted by the Sikkim state government, and they couldn't get public jobs or even like jobs otherwise. So a lot of them actually started ecotourism homestays. The state also has homestays, they're running, but these homestays became so popular and successful because they could also use the anti-dam act. So the people were going in to see these anti-dam activists who were protesting against the state. And I write about this a little bit. For them, it was a way to say that we're not dependent on the state. Of course, who can start these homestays? It's also like the more, upper class folks in this region. You need a lot of capital to run this, and also same thing with social reproduction. It's mostly the women who end up doing the cooking, and it's the men who are doing the tour guides and that kind of work. But in Sikkim, it's not just the Lepchas, but other communities also who've started homestays, and it's been a way to buttress claims for scheduled tribe status or ethnic, and for a lot of young people who couldn't stand living in the plains, who couldn't get jobs there, who couldn't get jobs, government jobs or private jobs, that's the only way for them to stay on the land, So given all of these options, and the young people also don't have any skills to do agriculture, the rivers are drying up, so how do you stay on the land, right? So the homestays become, with all of its problems of exoticization, all the things that you're talking about, right? Those are legitimate criticisms, but homestays appear, to me, in this case, as a strategy for people in the meantime, right? Focus on the meanwhile, as a way to stay put on the land. So, do you see a similar kind of dynamic in Kalimpong?
If you can just pass it back all the way in the back there.
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. This was a very engaging panel. To Camelia, I was wondering on the question of embankments. There's been kind of new work, at least in the northeast of India, which says that one, of course, the embankment stops silt deposition, which you've talked about. But there's also work that says rivers these days, thanks to actually dam construction and just construction on rivers, especially the Padma River that it has Brahmaputra and Ganga coming in, they don't necessarily carry silt anymore, and they carry sand. And thus, the flood or banpani deposits sands and hurts agricultural fields, and especially during heavy flash floods, but also those sedimentary kind of flooding that happens. So how does this, or how does this play out on the in Bangladesh and then the Sundarbans itself? And also I was wondering on the question of embankments, how do because you talked of permanence in that way, so how do embankments work in stabilizing and creating that kind of permanence in riverways where parts of rivers are shifting themselves and they're supposed to be changing? So then what remains the work of embankments is also what I was wondering. And to Sarah, I just had a question. I was wondering, when you talk of the production relations, when it comes to the homestay tourist economy, where actors and groups and companies like Airbnb are also becoming big players, especially in the Northeast. They've become these unregulated regulatory figures of homestays economy, where funding and research is also happening. So they're also funding, if you want to work, you can just apply for a grant at Airbnb, and kind of creating paths, and also in that way creating paths for tourism. And how are they kind of figuring as actors, where there are also social movements that Mabel also talked about, but even in Assam, Akhil Gogoi has his own homestay cultural hub. So, and then there are also these figures like Airbnb. So, and how does the distribution and production relation work with these companies and players coming in? Thank you.
Well, yeah, one more question, and then we'll save a bunch for the next round.
Okay, my questions are kind of related. Especially, my question to Camelia is something what Devika mentioned, that about the floods. In the climate change discourse of Bangladesh, do they talk about what is happening upstream? Let's say begin with Farakka Barrage, but also dams in Arunachal and other places. And I'm saying this because when anti-dam agitation was happening in Assam, there are activists who has actually kind of tried to measure that how long it takes for silt to carry all the way, let's say, from the entry point of Brahmaputra from Arunachal Pradesh all the way to Dhubri. So that kind of calculations was also going on in order to create a solidarity against the anti-dam movement within Arunachal Pradesh. So if there is a discussion about that, and if it is, what kind of it is. To Sarah, I think my question is very similar to Mabel. And again, what Devika said, Akhil Gogoi being the face of anti-dam agitation, but he also now promote culture, true homestay culture. And I happened to be in one of those homestays once, thanks to the Citizenship Amendment Act protest, and I couldn't reach home. And I had my tickets 2 weeks later. So what would I do sitting in Calcutta? We end up going to Kalimpong. and
many people do.
This is the cheapest option because it's closer to home. And the homestay we ended up staying is what exactly was Mabel saying, someone who got tired of staying in city, so they moved back to their home, but their mother would often take us to the top floor of the house and show us the Tista, and like literally like get angry about what the dams have done to the river. So like you mentioned about the conversations about happening about within farmers about the anti-dam hesitation. So I just was curious, like what are the conversations? And finally, to Professor Jain, I was actually very fascinated by your talk because there's so much that I myself is interested in the question of dams. Like my work is about dams and how dams are no more just a dam. It's way more than that, and that's how I try to talk about when a dam is not a dam. But the whole question that all this, like let's say Sardar Sarovar was a dam first, like it was proposed as a dam, but like all this, I would call it for now, paraphernalias that has come along with all the infrastructures. When did it start? Was it like, was it after World Bank withdrew, and how did it came to be? Like, what processes pushed it to become what it is now? And especially one other question was about the materialistic aspect of especially the Statue of Unity, because to build a Statue of Unity, they're actually carrying iron ores from all of India. That's how it does the Statue of Unity, all the way from Arunachal Pradesh, where they're building this large number of dams right now. So like, did they figure those also in these narratives of like unity and building this statue? Like how infrastructures are also building this networks in that place, but beyond those places as well. And like, what is it doing? Like, if you can share something about that. But thank you again to all the presenters for their presentation.
Great, thanks. We'll just take a moment and try to answer some of those questions, and then we'll do another round.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? No? A little bit now? Better? Okay. Thanks for these great questions. I think I'll bundle them up a little bit, and apologies if I don't answer them properly. So Llerena and Mabel's question, and even yours, your name I didn't catch, they are kind of interconnected in a way. So Llerena asked about the penalties for speaking out, right? And Mabel, you were talking about, can you...
Local interest, is there sandlining mafia, politicians, cronies, all those people who are benefiting?
Yeah, so actually the construction of embankments, they lead to a lot of money, right? So usually that has been under the purview of engineers at the Bangladesh Water Development Board. These are infrastructure projects. They don't use local labor, they use contractors. These are big money solutions, and that means that maybe the material is worsened than what the budget is for, and people are making money. So you get sluice gates that stop working for a while, and embankments that erode. And that gives us to your question there, and that is, the British try to impose permanence and stability on a dynamic delta, right? So what happens is that the rivers meander and they're very forceful. So these embankments break, and they break constantly. And so ever since 2011, the issue has been the lack of funding for maintenance by donors. So a strategy is to have Bangladeshi engineers saying, yes, it's climate change, give us money, like this conference I write about. It all starts with the history of polders and how they worsen siltation, and ends with, we need funds to help Bangladesh with climate change. It's just fantastic, just like analyzing that speech. And so these infrastructures that are there, and you can't remove them, people live next to them, they use them as roads. Water transport is gone, but no one wants to maintain them unless you get World Bank climate change adaptation money. So I think the reason for the lack of protest has been the fact that they haven't made them wider and bigger. They have repaired faulty sluice gates. They've excavated canals, which everyone loves, right? And repaired it where it's eroding. And that takes us to another question about, I think your question was how the silt and the sand is in Bangladesh. And so one, we have chores, you have accretion, so that's going on. We still have chores coming up in Bangladesh. but also the fact that this Vanderbilt study with Stephen Goodbread and others, they saw that after the 2009 Isla embankment, and I write more about this in the book, but the areas that do tiger prawn farming, they bring in salt water during the dry season. So what do? They cut and break the embankments. They insert these illegal pipes to bring in salt water during the dry season, which is the opposite of how bunds started in the region, right? So when Isla hit, you saw, and I write more about this in the migration article, that I kind of have a screenshot on. But basically, when Isla hit, you saw that most of the tiger prawn producing villages saw their embankments break heavily because they were structurally unstable. And so this Goodbread study, they found that this area, which was kind of south of my field site, they couldn't produce land there because the salt water during the dry season meant salt water coming in, right? But it also brought in sediment, and the land was raising. So there's these discussion amongst natural scientists in Bangladesh about sediment management, silt management, how to break the embankments in strategic location, how to maybe implement compensation for doing so to raise the did I miss to talk about this? I think I missed to talk about an image in my presentation, right? Yeah,
I think you mentioned that, like,
the land inside is lower than the sediment bed outside. So somehow getting sediment inside the embanked floodplains is something natural scientists are talking about, but how to implement that politically, socially, that is, I think, where social scientists have a role. And I was talking about my book at Brack University, and I was asking, if you're working with digital technologies, can Bcash be a way forward to compensate everyone living in a region if you want to address these sediment imbalances? Because, but I haven't looked into sand mining. I have colleagues like Anwesha Dutto and her colleagues, they're looking into sand mining. I think Farhan knows a bit more about sand mining, but the sand mining hasn't been my thing yet. And Delta Development Project happened after I did my fieldwork, so that could be a completely new research project for anyone to pick up. I think I answered everyone's, maybe.
Your turn.
Okay. Oh gosh, there's so much. And closer? Yeah. So let me start with Llerena, because I feel like you really got to what's driving me in a lot of what I'm doing by foregrounding space, and there was a bit of that in the discussion with Debashri the other day too. So when you ask about other people's readings of the exhibits, I love that you picked up on the fact that this is not that kind of reading. It's not actual, just like semiotic decoding, because I think the register in which these sorts of projects are unfolding is really so embodied. It is about a choreography of movement through space, right? And space is so central here because of the regime of the sensible, of untouchability, and there you talk about Joe Lee's work, which I love. So that is the main thing, is access to space. That's what one desires, right? Or that's the powerful thing, granting access, excluding, etc. And so Modi, you saw all those pictures of him welcoming you to the space and saying, please try river rafting, please go to the nutrition park, etc. So he's the host, and he's the one inviting you into the space. So that's the register in which the exhibits are experienced. So the whole thing is an exhibit. And then it's punctuated by selfie spots. So it's all about it's a mise en scène. Right, it's providing this mise en scène for you to be who you want to be in this space, and that I have found very powerful and actually moving. I didn't talk about it, but the thing is, you see people dressing up to be in this space, to be photographed in the space, right? So that's kind of what it's about. And so it's really they know how to orchestrate performance in this. So that's the register. And of course, also, if one was to point out something that's, of course, that Statue of Unity laser show is the big spectacle. They love the Glow Garden. But also a big hit was, you saw the young Adivasi girl, the guide, trumpeting the praises of the dam and the building of the statue and talking about how it all happened. So that is also, it's a performance of triumph over the NBA, and that's the really poignant part, is yes, the NBA inspired these other movements and so on, but this is just a big, thumbing their nose at all of what went before. So that's about other people's readings, but then the design of the exhibits and so on, fascinating, and I have to do more work on this because it goes from that slick-looking museum was designed, actually, I found, by this global consortium called Lord Cultural Resources, headquartered in Toronto. So I have to go, I have to go check them out. But they have offices in Asia. They have one in Mumbai. So I need to figure out. And the thing is that they are doing a bunch of other museums. I think they did the Bihar Museum, which is, again, much celebrated. Like all these things, we have to go look at them. We have to go see what's going on. They're building a tribal leaders museum nearby. There's another town close by, down the river. Why is it the Tribal Leaders Museum? What kind of briefs are they giving? Who's giving the brief? To whom? How much is the narrative controlled? I'm not sure. So this one has to find out. I do know that there was one kind of bureaucrat, a Gujarat government bureaucrat, who was orchestrating a lot of this stuff, but it was also very decentralized. So when I was asking the zoo guy, like the person in charge of the zoo, about the painted backdrops for the bears and so on, like, what was that about? And asking how the design was done, he said, and he's a forest department official, mind you. So that's the other thing. These people, the aesthetics are being driven by engineers. Or these forest department people. The guy who did the lighting was the person who came up with the laser light show, who's an engineer from Hyderabad who grew up in Gujarat. So, it's not the artists, I'm sorry to say. And even if it was, what difference might it make? We don't know. But the thing is, it's very decentralized, the design. So the forest department guy was talking about how they all sat together and they came up with ideas. So all the bureaucrats and officials. So this is who was doing the design. So as a result, they really had a finger on the pulse of the viewership, who is also people like them, right? This is not foreign tourists. This is not, elites from the big cities. It's not cosmopolitan woke types. It's, people from the region, very, as we might say, vernacular tourists. So I think that's part of why it's so compelling. Quick one for Mabel. Just a response, because I think they tried doing the homestays at Ekta Nagar as well, Adivasi homestay, but it never took off. And I think why it was precisely because they wanted to get them off the land. So in fact, they have built these sort of concrete homes, these like box-like homes with very minimal gardens to displace people from the tourist route. You see, some of these villages are along the bus route. Oh, what I forgot to mention, choreography. You cannot take your own car, so you have to take either the shuttle buses or those pink auto rickshaws driven by Adivasi women along a very designated route. And these villages are along the route, and a kind of eyesore, right? Or a reminder of what was there before. So they want to actually move those. that's why they built those concrete dabbas. But then, who wants to do a homestay in like this kind of housing? So I think that's why that project never really took off there, for precisely the reason that you identify. How did it all start? It started with the dam, the statue, and I think that this is all about, again, a slap in the face of the movement, right? Just, declaring the might of the state. And this is all Gujarat, right? So these are all Modi's pet projects. So have to have the biggest statue, biggest cricket stadium, fastest train, etc. All of this is happening in Gujarat. So when the dam comes up, that's when they start after the dam. While they're building the dam, so Modi declares the building of the statue in 2010 to celebrate 10 years as the Chief Minister of Gujarat. So this is a gift from Gujarat to the nation and the world. That's what he calls it. So that's his sort of moment of triumph, and therefore also he's chosen Sardar Patel because Sardar Patel is not Gandhi or Nehru, but he's a Gujarati. So he's most amenable to being made over. I mean, there's a lot of story behind that. So basically, all of this happens after the statue comes up, and they realize nobody's actually going to come to see the statue because it's really far away from everywhere. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's in the jungle. That's why they have to turn the jungle into this utopia, right? So, I mean, that's just the short story. But we can, and the iron, yes, where in the lead up to the 2018 elections, when was the election? 2019, no, so, yes. So, no, then it was the early 2014 elections. There was all this, so then Modi takes the Statue of Unity from being a Gujarat government project to a national project as he makes the transition. And that's when he starts all of this collecting money and so on for the statue, not because they need the money, but to incorporate the body politic into the body of the statue. And he does this in a very material way by collecting iron from all the farmers of India. So this is a big drive where the farmers are materially part of this embodiment. So it happens. It's not that successful, but they get some of the implements. Then they find that the iron is too low grade to actually be able to use in the statue, so they use it elsewhere in the project. So basically, all of it is quite a damp squib. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say.
Okay, here I mean, just super quickly. I mean, Llerena, yes, and thank you for that. I mean, just to kind of think about, right, the kind of long, kind of messy trajectories of both landscape and kind of history and temporality, kind of read through the landscape is what I want to kind of do. And one of them, maybe just to kind of think and then answer the kind of three questions kind of together, is to kind of undermine in a way that looking at the Hill Station, there's been lots of literature on the Hill Station as the reproduction of colonial rule, the reproduction of Europeanness. But if you kind of have just this somewhat ocular centrist vision of the Hill Station as bounded by the town part, and not kind of thinking about the way that the Hill Station actually eats and feeds itself, it kind of leads a lot about the kind of social reproduction of colonial rule, the social reproduction that allows kind of, rule to reproduce itself kind of off the table, right? So they're kind of just bringing, again, bringing that kind of, reproductive lens to kind of that colonial history, but then also then kind of what are the legacies of that project in the present brings us then to homestays. And yes, Mabel, I think I muted that a little bit in this. The kind of almost axiomatic phrase, this is the way we can stay on our land. But as you point out, that there's a class discrepancy there too, right? Because what happens in Kalimpong is it happens probably in lots of places, right? The kind of making money, especially if you're a single man or have the ability to kind of be a mobile man in some corporate sector in India and then coming back to the hills to run a hill station, right? And that's like a different homestay. It's a different homestay than the syndicated homestays that make up the majority of the homestays, right? Because those men like can say no if they don't want a particular tourist, right? And they can kind of be a little choosy. They have maybe different means. Airbnb is like the most bourgeois kind of way of kind of getting tourists. Like there's a scale of it, right? That's like the super elite vision of homestays, right? To be able to kind of put yourself up on Airbnb and to be a little bit more discerning about who comes on, right? Because you can kind of say you're busy or whatever, you can say you're full. And so yes, like, but that kind of like, and then why the leasing in Bengal is interesting to me is that it's also in a way to stay on one's land. However, right, what happens is that, various kind of tourism agent comes in, leases a property, generally it's not owned or leased already. And then the people who formerly lived there, often for generations, then come work the homestay, right? So they're staying on their land, but in a very different way, right? So the staying on the land kind of axiom is definitely something that I'm trying to kind of think with. But then the kind of, what does that mean that this is, quote, as you very much as you point out, the only way to stay on your land in the context of this kind of change. So yes, like absolutely, and that's like super important, especially for the youth, right? And the kind of, right, the majority of homestays that I've kind of looked at in North Bengal, they may be kind of funded by the chief minister's kind of various tourism campaigns, but they're in these kind of syndicates, right, where like a tourist, like, I don't know, Parag, maybe you were this person, maybe you weren't, maybe you went the Airbnb route, but okay, it's cool. That's like, it's cool. But anyway, so like you contact an agent in Kolkata and they book you the whole shebang. They get you a driver, you go one night in Kalimpong, or one night in this village in Kalimpong, one night in that village in Kalimpong, and then you go on this road from Kalimpong to Natula, and then from Natula, you spend one night in Gangtok, or outside of Gangtok, right? So it's like this whole package deal. Everything is sealed up. It's one price for the whole package. That's what most of the tourism is. And right, and so like again, like just overwhelming majority. And so yeah, so like what y'all are talking about, like that's like, because like that's like the in a way, like the way to kind of have some kind of sovereignty, some kind of control over your house, over your property, and whether or not they're anti-dam activists, to your kind of point, Parag, but like, I mean, yeah, like most of the people, like lots of people have hot takes on the dams, right? That they've changed the seasons, right? That like everyone kind of will agree that like they have brought unwelcome environmental change in various, that doesn't necessarily, like, so, but most of the people I work with are not anti-dam activists like the way that Mabel's talking about anti-dam activists, but like the kind of deleterious effects of what the damming has done for water supply, for road destruction, but the roads are what enables homestays to kind of come in the first place. So the very roads that allowed that kind of came with hydropower, are also kind of, or in Rega, right, to some of Nanaka's early work, right, that is what facilitates all these homestays as well, right, because like you have to be able to drive right to the door and park, and what is the bucolic image? It's the ability to look at, right, so these syndicate properties are all ones where you can see the range. You have to be able to see the range. You have to be able to sit and see. Like that is it, right? Which is very much like of a piece with Satyajit Ray's kind of, right? For like the whole movie, right? Or whole film is like waiting for those hills to come out, right? Like that's just like this internal reoccurrence of the experience of the hills, right? Which is again quite codified in a lot of Bengali literature as well, right? From the independence era to the present. But yeah, so I'll stop with that.
Great. We're going to run out of time here, so let's take a few questions, and then we'll bundle them up, and we'll have to have them spill into tea time and the next conversation. But there are a number of hands on this side, so I'd love to. I'm the last one. Okay. Yeah, Parasmita, do you want to go? Yeah.
So just a quick question for Sarah. So did you see, like in Arunachal, because there's homestays all over the Northeast, right? So do you see a transfer of labor, like to work the homestay from the plantation to the, I mean, is that something that also happens? So I'd be interested.
We'll just keep the questions piling up, sorry.
I have a comment and then I think a pretty small question. And the comment is actually one that's a compliment to all the panelists and also to Llerena for wonderful discussant remarks because, you know, we've been talking over the last couple of days about what are we doing collectively to generate theory, history, practice, kind of new accounts of climate change. And what I really appreciated about this set of papers was the way in which in South Asian studies, certainly in art history, there is a lot of focus on the city, on global cities, megacities, metropolitan formations, and that all of these papers thought through urban-rural relations in very complex and compelling ways, that you can't think city and country apart from each other. The corridor is a wonderful example of that, but there are many others. So I really appreciated that across these papers. And then the other pattern that I noticed, and Llerena's comments really pulled it together for me, was that I think something that came up is that maybe in Sarah's paper was something like, well, what do we mean when we say climate change? And it's not often that we think of the homestay, but I'm thinking about actually quite literally the visual images that came across, whether it's the image of the peacocks on the terrace, or it's the image of this kind of park at the Sardar Sarovar Dam, or it's not actually the image that you wanted to use on the cover, Camelia, but some of the kind of images of everyday life. What does it mean to live with embankments? And I thought these were very compelling to think about as cultural production or instances of cultural production, and resonated with Nenika's paper this morning about, like, we think about climate change through disaster or the trope of disaster. And of course there is that. I mean, none of you are saying that landslides don't exist, but there's also like misbehaving cats and, you know, some of the other kinds of examples that you related today. The question is for Kadri, and it's this. It's the one that came to mind when you said, what's the before of this before? And I'm thinking not only of the kind of remaking of nature and culture in Modi's India, or in India before that, like let's say post-liberalization India, but that there has been, you know, from the colonial period onward, even before that, right, a remaking or reordering of nature and culture. And what was the landscaping or garden imagination of the Nehruvian era dams, like Pakranangal or whatever? And because so much of Modi's plan is about remaking Nehruvian India specifically, whether it's the Central Vista in New Delhi. So what are these dams doing in relation to those dams?
Okay, I'm going to go first just because I have a very similar before-after question for the entire panel. Thank you, that was terrific, really, really wonderful. And I was also thinking in this before and after. So Kadri, with your paper, I was wondering about your work in Lucknow, in the Kashiram, Mayavati Park, and in what ways are these aesthetics different? Because what is quite implicit in your paper is the link to the Hindu Rashtra and Modi's figure everywhere. But I was also, like Sonal, also wondering about other sort of aesthetics around this. I was also actually thinking a lot about the Tehri Dam, where it's now like Old Tehri, what is now called Old Tehri, the town that was submerged by the Tehri Dam, is now actually just called Tehri Jheel. And you go there and you go water skiing, you do boating, you do kayaking, there's an amusement park over there. But the whole aesthetics of it are quite different from what we were seeing at Sardar Sarovar. So how much of this is Gujarat and, you know, the long history of Modi's rule or the BJP's hegemony there versus the rest of India. Camelia, with your talk, I was again thinking about, you know, the older developmental literature that we have, which is written where we've got a lot of work on how development projects are misread or misunderstood, and then you have these fake kind of, these problematic development interventions that then actually exacerbate the problem rather than removing them. And I wondered about how your misreading the Bengal Delta actually, because this is very explicitly about climate change, right? And the whole development industry that has come up around climate change in Bangladesh. But in what ways does this intersect with these older developmental interventions that we see across the global south? And Sarah, I loved your talk, and there's so many resonances. I, of course, want to really ask you about the crooked peacocks and when they turned up, but I'm not going to ask you that. I really wanted to know actually about the tourism aspect of it, because again, this is something you see in Uttarakhand, where Mussoorie is like exactly the same, jam-packed roads, impossible to get there, people complaining, we paid so much money, it's so hot, it's so crap. This nostalgia for the British Raj, for consumption of tourism and leisure in the way that we saw, not in Satyajit Ray films, but maybe James Ivory merchant films, where heat and dust, all of that, right? And so I wondered how one traces that history of this is something I'm also sort of obsessed with, that how do we, as ethnographers or, amateur historians, try to trace the history of how these spaces have become this present, this sort of dystopic present where tourism seems like hell rather than a chutti, rather than a holiday.
I really enjoyed the panels, and what is really interesting in this set of presentations was the thick materiality of the presentations. I mean, there was really kind of, it was about material, it was about affect, it was about really kind of dealing with the thicknesses of lived relationships and how they intersect with material. I think my question is really about the after, what is it, where is that sliver of hope? Where is this after? Does it have to be really, do we really have to wait for the breakdown of the regime? Or are there any, is there a breakdown happening at the edges? Or, are there tactical practices that are, that one sees? So, yeah, the question is really the after of the after.
Lalita, I think you have the last word. Yeah. That's it. You're the last.
Okay.
The
Hi.
last of the last.
You can hear me, right? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Like I said, I want to echo it. Perfect ending to our 3 days. It's just beautiful papers, elegant response, all of it. I have a kind of question for Sarah, suggestions on a very rich paper, but just sort of like, and Camellia sort of like as a way of, as with Llerena, I want to sort of think of shifting sands as a way of rethinking the ways in which we've been presenting our work as well. Sarah, very quickly, in terms of our time. As you were presenting your paper, it was so interesting. There was a little footnote you were suggesting to the Qatari building of stadiums and the Nepali bodies and the kidneys, et cetera, right? So my head was off to homestays in Kerala, which are very much similar in the remittance economies from the Gulf, right? So in a way that I was actually curious, it's the same sort of, I don't know what the questions of land would be, but it's connected to the Ayurvedic pathways that are all over Kerala. It's very similar to this, of absentee for not landlords, absentee owners, and then there's this wonderful book written by a former colleague of mine who's now at UPenn, Ana Lopez, which is called Remittance Architecture for Mexico. Okay, so in a way that so that was a way of opening it up. In a way of, I was thinking about the way in which capital works, accumulates, and the way in which remittance economy works. For Kadri, as you were talking, of course, this is lovely, right? One gets to see a third version of what you're obsessing with. I mean, they play, I was like, okay, I don't have to go here. I've already seen it, thanks to Kadri's presentation.
You don't need to go.
Yeah, exactly. No, I don't need to go. What is interesting again and again are, again, your kind of footnotes, Disney-like, and the level, I mean, there's a whole lot written on Disney Celebration, Disneyland, etc., which also suggest all these particular prescriptions that are there, right? People who've done ethnography, etc., right? So there's that. So I was wondering, as you were talking and responding, whether one could see this, and this is for Rupali, whether one could see this as a commemoration as a monument to forgetting the damn movement, which is kind of what your suggestion is, right? I mean, it's a monument to forgetting. I mean, it's like, how else can you read this in its kind of extravagant colors and light shows, et cetera, right? So that was one that I wanted. The other is, there's a Chinese version of this through mainland China, through filmmaking. Jia Shankar's film, The World, is precisely this kind of hubris. But over there, of course, the hubris is more worldly. It's like you don't have to go to Paris and you don't have to go to Italy. The monuments are right here in your backyard, right? So there's a kind of there's there's a way of making a cosmopolitanism within and that too is located way outside Beijing, etc. But over there, so I mean, I'm just sort of suggesting this as a way of thinking about, like, there are similar kind of crazy projects elsewhere, which are also, and in, I mean, for camellias, it's like it's so beautiful, just the idea of silting and the different forms of embankment. I was less interested in embankment, that was your main thing, but I was more interested in the different forms of silting and salt, etc. So thank you so much for the detail. I don't know, I mean, I want to be able to think about your project more. So I'm sorry, I don't have a question, but I was inspired as a way of thinking of it as a spine for the papers today. Yeah, thanks so much again, folks.
Thank you, everyone, for terrific questions, and to our fabulous panelists. So.